I'm going to be sharing a presentation with you that I'll introduce in a second, but I'm aware with someone who is as significant a figure from recent history, unlike last week's more medieval forgotten life, that there may well be people here who have more knowledge or more intimate knowledge indeed of the life that we're talking about this evening. I was talking with one of my congregants who just happened to casually mention that they'd had supper while they were living in South Africa with Helen Suzman. Unfortunately, her computer's down, otherwise she would have come and joined us and given a brief vignette of having met Helen Susman herself. But equally, if any people here have experience of or have met at any point Helen Susman, then I'm hoping there would be an opportunity for you to add to, supplement, correct, improve what I'm going to talk through with you this evening. And I'll do my best, though I don't claim to be an expert in her, to firstly answer the question I put up on this slide, which is why choose her for this series. And my reasons were that she is someone who has very much stood against the crowd, has gone against the perceived orthodoxy of her own country, has stuck to her principles, and went about things in a particularly unorthodox way, but also with remarkable skill, brilliance, and talent. So what I'm hoping we'll cover is something of a biography, a talk through her life a little bit, an opportunity to hear her voice, and there's an incomplete sentence there because I edited it 2 minutes ago and forgot to finish the edit. We will have an opportunity to hear her voice, and we'll hopefully hear from some of you as well. And I'm hoping, and this I'll leave as an optional thing depending on how we go for time, that we might hear some excerpts of a speech of hers. I would have loved to have found a recording of her speech being delivered by her in Parliament. I haven't been able to do that, but I have found at least the text of one, well, more than one speeches were available, but there's one that is particularly celebrated that she delivered in 1970, and we might hear some of the paragraphs of that as part of this evening. So if you have any questions or any comments, or if you have anything you'd like to add, then please do chip them into chat, and I will try and keep my eye on that and see if there's anything else that comes in that could be helpful to add variety of voice and perspective to this evening. So having mentioned the pattern of the session that I'm proposing, let's go back to the 7th of November 1917 when Helen Susman was born to Samuel and Frida Gawronski, and they were immigrants to South Africa from Eastern Europe, as so many were, trying to escape from the pogroms, and they settled in a suburb really of Johannesburg. You can see the black dot is placing her town of birth there and its proximity to the centre of Johannesburg. She grew up there fairly comfortably. It was a gold mining town, and so I think was doing pretty well in that era. She went not far away, and you can see that just slightly north of central Johannesburg is the University of Witwatersrand, or Witwatersrand. But she didn't stay there very long because she dropped out of university to get married. And having married Dr. Moses Suzman, she returned to university after the wedding, and she graduated with a first in each of her two majors, economics and economic history. Her first main job was as a statistician during the war, working for the War Supplies Board, putting her training obviously to use. But her intellect took her back to the university to become a lecturer in economic history. And she stayed there for a total of 8 years until an opportunity came up that allowed her to express herself in a more full fashion. And that was an opportunity to be nominated or gain the nomination as a member of the minority, even then United Party candidate for a local constituency. She gained that nomination and was elected as an MP in 1953. And in total, she then went on to serve in Parliament for 36 years. And part of the reasons why she's so important is that for 6 of those years, she was the only female parliamentarian. For 13 of those years, after the breakaway formation of the Progressive Party in 1959, and the Progressive Party then was decimated in the 1961 election, she was the only progressive MP in Parliament opposing the National Party's growing and embedding of apartheid as the policies of the country. And for 13 years, she was the only progressive MP standing out against those policies. How she did it, we'll hear from her explaining a little bit about that later on in this session. Here she's asked about her day.
Mrs. Suzman, how do you go about your parliamentary work?
Well, of course, during the session, I'm very busy indeed, because my day starts at about 9:30 in the morning, where I go to my office, and I have a vast pile of mail to deal with, some of it fortunately anonymous, so I can throw that away. And thereafter, I have to study bills that are coming up for the day's work, prepare questions for ministers, and generally speaking, get myself ready for debates in the House. The House itself, of course, sits all afternoon and sometimes in the evenings as well. And there I simply have to sit it out in debates and wait for my turn to speak. My preparation for the work, of course, involves a good deal of research work. I'm fortunate in having a very able research secretary who does assist me in getting background material for the speeches I'm going to make. And then I'm very lucky in having a party behind me, which consists of many enlightened people who are experts in their own fields. And I am able to call on these people for their advice and suggestions on different debates. But I'm a very busy person indeed.
Mrs. Suzman, do you see any future for what might be termed progressive forces in South Africa?
Oh yes, I see a great deal of future, otherwise I wouldn't think this job was worth continuing. The future, I think, lies in the fact that the entire economic development of South Africa depends eventually on the adoption of progressive ideals, which is the utilization of labor resources, the opening up of economic and other opportunities to all people of all races in South Africa. And I think despite all governmental efforts to stem this tide, quite inevitably, policy will have to adapt itself to the economics of the situation. Economics are stronger than politics.
What are your plans for the future?
Well, my plans are to continue as I have been, and that is to attempt to put our alternative policy to the electorate of South Africa in the hope that one can get them to understand how important it is to make the necessary concessions from a position of strength, rather than waiting until those concessions might be forced on the country, either by internal trouble or by external forces, although all this, I must admit, is a distant possibility.
Do you experience any form of government hindrance in your work?
Well, so far we've had none whatever, I'm happy to say, and I think the government would be extremely silly if it did attempt to put any hindrance in our way. We are a duly constituted party. We do not believe in any revolutionary methods of bringing about change. Our idea is to convince people of the correctness of our policy and to try and have evolutionary changes according to the circumstances in South Africa. So far, however, we have not suffered any direct inhibitions from the government. We are, like everybody else in South Africa, under certain indirect inhibitions. There is always, of course, the knowledge that in the background there are steps that the government can take which go outside the normal rule of law in democratic countries. These factors act as inhibiting factors.
To go away from that for a moment, does the Scandinavian boycott of South African goods have any effect at all, to your knowledge?
Quite honestly, I think not. I don't think most people even know that there is a Scandinavian boycott of South African goods. And the country, you see, is basically so strong economically that really the standard of living is going up all the time in South Africa, and development is proceeding apace. This is a good field for the investment of capital, and I don't think that South Africans are feeling the effect of the boycott at all.
Mrs. Suzman, the Defence and Aid Fund, to which so many Scandinavians contributed, was this doing any good at all?
Well, as you probably know, Defence and Aid was recently banned by the government,
Yes.
and therefore no longer functions. Defence and Aid did good insofar as it provided necessary defence for people who were charged with crimes in South Africa, mostly of a political nature. I must say that something has got to be done to find some alternative to Defence and Aid. The government states that it does provide a certain amount of free legal aid, and that is true. But I think it has also been shown on investigation that not sufficiently broad basis for legal aid is provided to cover all the cases under which people might be brought to court in South Africa. So we've got to look for some other means whereby we can assist people who are going to be charged with certain crimes to obtain the necessary defence. It is my clear view that everybody is entitled to defence in the court of law.
I see.
I'm just going to stop the sharing there, and I'll come back to it in just a moment. Firstly, to reassure you that that was the original colour, whether it was a radio interview originally, but they ran a camera on it, or whether it was intended as a TV interview without any lighting, I don't know. But that's the text as we have it back in. That interview was conducted in 1966, and already you can sense the regime tightening its grip on all aspects of life and civil democracy as we might see it. Defence in Aid was a scheme to support the equivalent of legal aid, but not non-governmental support for those people who were defending themselves. And significantly, again, you hear that the Defence in Aid scheme was declared illegal by the government. So even things that might have allowed people who were being tried to get what we might hope would always be standard assistance, those things were being taken away at that time. So we're in a context where at that time, as you are all probably aware, we already have a number of
Mrs. Suzman.
prisoners, and foremost among them would be someone who would become much more famous over subsequent decades. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned, and during the early years of his incarceration, Helen Suzman was seeking to get opportunities to verify for herself as an MP whether conditions on Robben Island were as they had been described in some media, both within South Africa and internationally. And after several years of continually asking, I think the Ministry of Justice ran out of ways in which they could say no, basically. And so they found they had to say yes. And so the Minister of Justice, Pete Pelser, at the time, acceded to her request, and that led to her first meeting with the prisoner Nelson Mandela. Excuse me. So if I expand slightly on the text that's in front of you, she wrote afterwards, "I was taken by the chief warder to the single cell section where all the political prisoners were kept. I stopped to talk to the first inmate of this section, who told me not to waste time talking to any of them, but to go to the end of the row where I would find their leader, Nelson Mandela. I did as he had suggested, and I was immediately impressed by Mr. Mandela, for whose release I had already pleaded time and again in Parliament. Inside the cell, at the end of this section, stood this tall, composed man who put his hand through the bars and said, 'I'm very pleased to meet you.' I replied, 'I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Mandela, and I have come to get information about the treatment political prisoners are receiving on Robben Island.' Now, despite the presence of the chief warder, Mandela had no hesitation in reeling off all the objectionable conditions to which the prisoners were subjected. He described the inadequate clothing they wore during icy winters on the island, poor and inadequate food. They were sleeping on bedrolls on the floor. They had no access to newspapers. He also told me there was a warder who had a swastika tattooed on the back of his hand and who was very tough with them when they were at hard labour in the lime quarry. Armed with this information, I went back to Justice Minister Pelser and repeated what I'd learned. I also told Parliament, here was a man who not only had great leadership qualities, but was, I believed, the only man who could bring about peaceful reconciliation in South Africa. This is 1967, she said this. Mandela subsequently remarked, "It was an odd and wonderful sight to see this courageous woman peering into our cells and strolling round our courtyard. She was the first and only woman ever to grace our cells." That in itself, I think, is pretty remarkable in all its sadness as well as its appreciation for Helen Suzman herself. Now, we're doing reasonably well on time, so if I had been much more organised, I would have tried to get a separate voice to mine to be able to give voice to her words. But my apologies that I haven't been that organised and there isn't a separate second voice that can give you a break from my tones. But Susman's speech in Parliament in 1970 is deemed one of the speeches that shaped South Africa, and it comes at a time when she is standing alone against the newly re-elected National Party, which is moving to entrench and amend its Bantu legislation even further, including, in this case, setting up national parliaments for the different tribal groups, trying to construct a bureaucracy that then allows them to claim that the white government is in fact a majority government because all the others are parts of a different country or republic in their own right, according to their tribal nationalities. So it's a long speech. I am not in any way going to attempt to read all of it, but I've tried to take a few clips of it that give a feel for the way in which she spoke. And just to highlight that point that's on your screens, the Helen Suzman Foundation, which she herself established in her retirement, one of their claims about her is that with the help of her researchers, she never got a single fact wrong in Parliament. I leave you to make any comparisons you wish to make to current politicians or governments elsewhere or in this country. So she spoke in Parliament against this legislation. And amongst the things she said was this: however, there is another aspect which is brought to the attention of this House this afternoon, namely the grandiose schemes for creating dozens of governments in South Africa. As I remember it, there are to be 11 in Southwest Africa, 8 in South Africa for the Africans, 1 for the Coloureds, 1 for the Indians, and 1 for the white people. That makes 22 governments for 20 million people. 1 government roughly for every million people is not a bad average. When one remembers that something like 36% of the gainfully employed white population in South Africa is directly or indirectly in state employment in this so-called free enterprise country of ours, one's mind absolutely boggles to think of the number of people who will now be absorbed in unproductive occupations in manning 22 governments and 22 civil services. There was the third point that the Honourable Minister made, on which I want to take issue with him. The third point was that he, nicknamed by Susman Merlin the Magician, will give to every single African a tribal identity. He will link him to his tribe. Each one will have his own country. How does the Honourable Minister know that the African wants this? Who is he to tell the urbanised African that he has to go back to tribal culture? How does the Honourable Minister know this? The Minister of Bantu Administration and Development then intervened in the speech and said, "Because I am in contact with them." To which Mrs. Susman replied, "The Honourable, the Minister's contact with urban Africans consists of telling them what he wants them to do and telling them what they must do. It does not consist of asking them or consulting them. Nothing of the kind. I want to tell the Honourable, the Minister, that he has forgotten that among the 3.5 million urban Africans, there are at least 2 generations that were born in the urban areas that have lost their tribal contact and want to have nothing to do with them. They don't want these ethnic groupings that he is forcing on them. The Honourable Minister is forgetting about 150 years of contact with Christianity. They do not retain their tribal culture once they have adopted Christianity. The Honourable the Minister cannot promote Christianity and tribalism any more than he can promote tribalism and the modern system of agriculture, for they are incompatible as well. You can see the way in which she constructs her arguments, both respectful of the political system, very much based on, I think, the UK Parliament. You can hear the Honourable Minister type phrasings that we're so familiar with as well. And then she goes on to talk about how one of the things he would have learnt is that it is completely irrelevant to bring in examples of what happened in the pre-war world. The whole world has changed. Not only geographically, it has changed politically and sociologically. Most of all, perhaps, it has changed in its attitude to race. It is for that reason that we appear to be so weird to the outside world. That is one of the reasons why the Honourable the Prime Minister finds it so difficult to sell the separate development or apartheid, or South Africa's colour policy, to the outside world. We are the only country that has moved backwards. Every other country in the world has been extending rights to people of colour, but this is not the position in South Africa. This is the only country where there has been a steady whittling away of the rights of the non-white people. And then she talks and critiques the Prime Minister even further. He believes, she says, if only we stop calling the country multiracial and start calling it multinational, we will be able to pull the wool over the world's eyes. Then we will apparently get over this whole business of a minority government, because it almost puts the whites in the majority in this country. In this way, it is thought that argument would be disposed of. Does he really think the world judges us by the myths that keep nationalists happy? Or does the world judge us by the realities of the South African scene? The Honourable the Prime Minister found this policy difficult to explain because the world judges us by realities. You cannot explain away the treatment of the urbanised Africans to people overseas. People do not believe that urbanised people want tribal culture, and they are quite right in not believing that. You cannot explain away the harshness of the policy as it is implemented today. I'm going to read you a little bit more because she references the UK government of the time in the next sentences, where she goes on to talk about the sport and things that we will know about as they developed. But this is in 1970, remember. Around the world, people do not consider an all-white team sent by South Africa as a team that comes from a country whose policies they disapprove of. They consider the South African all-white team, and I quote from a newspaper, as a roving embassy for racialism. And that is why we will never get our sporting policy accepted, even though we offer to send 2 teams to the Olympic Games. It is not going to work that way. South Africans must stop bluffing themselves that the cancellation of the cricket tour to Britain was the work of what they care to think of as long-haired demos and a bloody-minded British Labour Party government. Nothing of the sort. The issue became something far greater. It has become a race relations issue inside Britain itself. It has become a Commonwealth relations issue. That position will remain until we change our actual attitude inside South Africa. I could go on. I could go further, but I hope you get a feel for the language that she used and the power and clarity of her arguments with which she confronted the National Party and its government. As mentioned, she went through as an MP until 1989, and although she retired from Parliament in 1989, in no way could you say that she stopped being an active person influencing the future of the country. She served as the president of the Institute for Race Relations. She also critically served on the Independent Electoral Commission that oversaw the first democratic elections in 1994. And I'm sure many of you who are here this evening will remember the scenes of the days-long queues for people who were given the ability to write for the first time. She also was a member of the Statutory Human Rights Commission in South Africa and fought many battles there. And just to bring a footnote, on the 7th of November 2007, the nation celebrated her 90th birthday, and indeed she had a boulevard named after her to parallel one that was named after Mandela, and was given several other great accolades. She died peacefully in her sleep on the 1st of January 2009 at the age of 91. Just to bring a little bit more of this to life, I want to bring a couple more moments of her being, firstly of her being interviewed, and secondly of a tribute to her. Sorry, this is the tribute to her.
Born on the 7th of November 1917, Helen Suzman grew up in Johannesburg and launched her formidable political career as a young MP. She formed South Africa's first progressive non-racial party and famously occupied the Progressive Party's only seat in Parliament for 13 years. At a time when speaking out against apartheid came with harsh penalties, Susman waged a single-handed campaign against every piece of apartheid legislation put before Parliament. During Helen Suzman's 30-year career, she fought against pass laws, the Group Areas Act, forced removals, detention without trial, separate amenities, job reservation, the Mixed Marriages Act, and the Immorality Act. When a cabinet minister accused Suzman of asking questions just to embarrass South Africa overseas, she famously replied, "It's not my questions that embarrass South Africa, it's your answers." Suzman also fought for workers' rights and better conditions for political prisoners. In one of his letters to Helen, Albert Luthuli called her a bright star in a dark chamber where lights of liberty are going out one by one. Such was her contribution to the struggle that President Mandela asked her personally to accompany him when he signed the Constitution into law in 1996. Helen Suzman's tireless fight for justice and equality laid the foundation for the Democratic Alliance to become a party for all South Africans.
So that was a short video that was released by the Democratic Alliance to celebrate her, what would have been her 100th birthday. And I have to admit that when I came across that as I was researching this topic, I thought, well, actually that could be my whole presentation. I wouldn't need to say much more, but then we'd have a very, very short session. I hope I've given you a little bit of a feel for her, but I'm very keen, to have questions, and I'll do my best to answer them, but also to have any contributions and reminiscences or knowledge that other people in our community this evening, we're nearly 60 different screens of people gathered here. So if there are other things that people want to add, I'd be delighted to hear from people. So if anyone feels willing or brave enough to raise their hand, or I think, Tanya, people can unmute themselves, can they?
Yes.
So, and I can see, Wendy, you have. So
My husband Keith can.
Keith,
Keith.
okay.
Suzman was our MP, and we knew her and met her and were very impressed by her.
That's wonderful to hear. I had a feeling we'd have people who had that sort of connection. Can you just perhaps either of you elaborate on what it was that left that impression upon you, what it was that made you feel impressed by her?
Her knowledge, her ability to communicate, and her personality. And they were a very highly regarded family. Her husband, Dr. Moses Suzman, was very well regarded as a leader in the medical profession. And her family, the Gavronskis, were also very well appreciated, but she was outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's lovely that you've added that. As you were talking, you've reminded me of one of the other little snippets I came across, which said that of all the Jewish women who Mandela met until his release, in his early years working and so on, she was probably the only one, they reckon, who wasn't a communist.
Yeah, probably.
But she would have no truck with that sort of politics. She was very much a free market person, as you may have got a sense of in the speech that I was reading, but wanted a market that was fair as well as free. So thank you, Wendy and Keith. That's really lovely to have heard that little piece from you. And Wendy, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, he treated our daughter at times. Her husband Moses was a very, very respected man and a very good physician.
Lovely.
We lived in the same building, if I remember rightly, in the same block of flats in Johannesburg.
Oh, wonderful. That's great to hear. Thank you so much for that contribution. Are there others who would like to contribute or add or question about anything that we've been talking about? I can't believe we've got this many of us in a room and it's quiet.
Can I ask a question then, just to...
Yes, David, and then I'll come to June and Peter. David.
Keep this moving a little bit. Was she a person who was fearless? And was she a lawyer? And did her work ultimately contribute to the fall of the white minority government?
He was not a lawyer. He was very, very honest, straightforward. She didn't mince words, and she was straightforward in every way that you could ask for an MP to be.
Thank you, Keith. There you go. Someone who's been in her constituency giving you that part of the answer.
Yeah.
She studied economics, David.
Yeah.
And that was very much her field, economics and economic history. So there wasn't the legal training, but clearly from before she entered Parliament, she was committed to both the principles she stood for and also to doing her research and making sure that she had not only book learnt, but she was someone who wanted to get lived experience from people. So she was out in her constituency and out in the wider population. So when she was working on prison reform, she wanted to see the prisons before anything else. So not a lawyer, someone from a different discipline, but very much committed to those sorts of principles. Has that picked up your questions adequately?
Yeah. Do you think that her contribution
Sorry,
to,
that was the last part.
yes,
Yeah.
an important one, did it contribute to the fall of the white minority government?
I think in a number of ways she did. Firstly, by being perpetually the gadfly that was nagging at Parliament. And so she became nationally and internationally known for being the voice that was speaking out against the policies of the National Party in South Africa. And I think that was very important.
Sure.
Secondly, as we heard, she went and saw Mandela and the other prisoners in Robben Island, and whether we know her interventions led to conditions improving. Now, is it too much of a stretch to say her interventions may have helped keep Mandela and others alive? I'm not sure. It's certainly possible. Knowing that there was someone who was paying attention to what was going on in those prisons, certainly made it difficult for any political accidents to happen, I think. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the significance of her role as being a high-profile supporter of fair play, at least, and trying to make sure that they were there. Plus, then, when the transition was looking like it was going to happen under F.W. de Klerk, she played a role then quite substantially in helping shape the Constitution. And when Mandela signed the Constitution into being, for her to be present at his invitation is also quite a statement of affirmation, I think.
Yeah.
Okay? Thanks, David.
Thank you.
I said I'd come to Peter and then Michael, if I can come to you next.
Oh, yes. Richard, I just have a disturbing and worrying thought that if this wonderful woman had been a member of our parliament today, and I only wish she was, she would have to have police protection, and the chances would be very high that she would not have lived. Bearing in mind what's been happening to our MPs this last year or few.
I think it is something of that we should be appreciative of, that she, as she said in one of the interviews that I didn't include, going through, or maybe it was a clip in there, she talked about going through her correspondence, and a lot of it was anonymous, and she threw that away. Now, a lot of the anonymous correspondence was very abusive. But as soon as she knew it was anonymous, she would throw it away and let it be water off a duck's back. So I'm sure the conditions under which she was working were pretty scary as well. I guess we have to remember that, thankfully, politicians in our country don't get killed that often. I think it's worrying that we've had two in the span of 5 years, Joe Cox and David Amis, and equally, I think it's a difficult situation to compare. But yes, I think there is something about that we should worry about regarding the way in which our society is operating, that someone can't speak with as much principle and bring that set of beliefs into the public arena and hold to moral values in a very tight and deliberate way. But
yes, I agree.
What other people think. Thank you, Peter.
Well, I agree, but at the same time, the killers of our MPs weren't anonymous. They were proud of it and made it known.
And that's something of a different culture.
Yes.
Yeah. But thank you. Michael, I said I'd come to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask,
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if that's at Michael's end that we have the problem. Um, might be. Can I come to, is it Marlies? And then
Yes,
Michael,
yeah.
may I come back to you if your signal settles down a bit? Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It's been a true a treasure trove. I was wondering. I understand the important work that she's done politically. Did she ever speak out about being a woman in what was probably a man-dominated world? And did she ever talk about, how she saw herself in the light of female emancipation?
Thank you. It's a lovely question. I can only give you a partial answer in that I couldn't find anything. Over dinner earlier this evening, I was having the same conversation with my daughter, actually, about whether she was living through life in the way that we sometimes frame and the way you framed the question is perhaps a very contemporary framing of this issue. And my sense is that she didn't somehow see it that way. But nonetheless, for her to be the only woman in Parliament for 6 years, and then she would have been accompanied by a handful of other women. And for at least 7 of the years when there were other women, they were women on the National Party side. So, how it must have been for her is very difficult to tell. She didn't seem to be anyone through that period of the 70s, late 60s, 70s, who was in any sense mirroring some of what was happening in the United States and in this country and elsewhere in terms of the rise of the feminist movement. She simply seemed to be someone who wanted to put her principles into action, help people, and do that by going to be in Parliament. And that was her route. And I can't detect anything. I'd love to find a more rich addressing of your question. And maybe if either of us does, we can update the other. But
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And again, if anyone else here has anything to add to that, I'm very happy to hear from you as well. Michael, let's have another try with you and see if we can get somewhere with your question.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if yourself or any of the participants here this evening would be able to tell me if anyone knows any quotes or could quote any international leaders around the time that Helen Suzman was active in politics and in the South African Parliament that they had in regard of her. Any international leaders who maybe have been quoted as holding her in the regard that she deserved, the high regard that she deserved.
That's an interesting question, and I haven't come across. I admit I didn't go looking for it, but I haven't come across a sense of how was she viewed internationally and how did she interact with the political leaders of other countries at the time. Something certainly to think about, and I wouldn't venture to go beyond that for me. But again, I'm happy to see if anyone else can chip in. Thank you, Michael. Really interesting question, and I'll make a note and I'll see if I can come up with anything. If I deliver this program again, I'll want to make sure I've addressed that one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question Melissa has asked in the chat is, was she religious and how much did her Jewishness inform her actions? And it is kind of interesting that the research I did really skimmed over her childhood in the sense of what kind of family upbringing was it, and how religious was it? They talk about a family that was financially stable. She was clearly not so Jewish in terms of their practice, that one sign of that being she was educated at a convent school, so that's an indicator of something. But
Keith wants to say something on that.
Yes, Keith.
As far as a lot of Jewish people were concerned, the Catholic Church provided a very good basic education, both for boys and girls. A lot of us went to Catholic schools because they tended to be, this was prior to the Jewish day schools being opened, when all the Jewish people then went to them. But the convents and the Marist brothers and Christian brothers provided the education for most of us who could afford to go to those particular schools. As far as her Jewishness was concerned, I would say that basically, like a lot of South Africans of Litvak extraction, we tended to be members of the modern Orthodox, in other words, something similar to United Synagogues. We weren't overly religious, but we did attend synagogue.
Thank you, Keith. I think that's my sense. There was a strong Jewish identity without it necessarily being, in quotes, religious.
Correct.
And I think that she certainly never did anything to disown her Jewish status, and she owned it. And I think their daughters were brought up knowing that they were Jewish as well. And so there's that sense of Jewishness rather than necessarily being deeply embedded in Judaism, perhaps.
Correct.
Thanks, Keith. That's lovely. And Elizabeth, thank you for your comment. I think you're right in that her gender was one feature. My sense is that she was pretty aware of how privileged her upbringing was in terms of its economic. You mentioned, Elizabeth, the economic, social, cultural, and educational background that she had. And I think she did appreciate how advantaged she was by all those things. And there was something about how she saw beyond that into actually wanting to work for all the population to have more advantage. And one of the things in that 1970 speech that I read was that the policy was very much looking to, we would call it, ethnically cleanse the urban centres of South African cities by making it impossible for black people to stay in them, and looking to force them back into these new tribal states that were being created so that they would be a segregated people. And that's where she really wasn't having any truck with that. She really was very determined that an integrated multiracial state was the only fair way for things to be. Melissa, thank you for adding that someone in the Kent liberal Jewish community was one of Mandela. You've used his affectionate term, Nelson Mandela's lawyers. And it's certainly true that Jewish people featured very strongly in the struggle against apartheid. The list is phenomenally long of the number of different Jewish people you could name. And it starts with some integral people to the transformation of the country, Joe Slover being just one that we could mention, and Ruth First, his wife as well. She was also significant in that. Let me just see if there were any further. Celia Cox asked a question about was she involved with the Black Sash group. I don't. There was an answer from Keith.
Yes.
She was.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
My aunt was in the Black Sash.
Ah, right. Okay. For those who don't know, would you like to explain what the Black Sash group was?
It was a group, well, Wendy can explain it because her aunt was involved. It was a group of ladies who wore black sashes to signify their solidarity with the black people, and that they empathized and would do whatever they could within the bounds of the law to enable them to look after and treat black people as equals. They were a very difficult situation and a very difficult time.
Indeed they were. Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Wendy. And again, a lovely connection again.
And wasn't Richard,
yes.
Wasn't she killed in a car crash? A deliberate car crash. This was Molly. There was somebody called Molly in the Black Sash group. And I think she got killed.
I think that may be correct. I can't recall it.
Right. Yes, I don't know enough about the group to know the answer, but something for us all to go away and test our search engines with if we want to this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Celia, for the question, and Keith and Wendy, thank you for the answers. So we're coming towards 8:30 and what should be our scheduled finish time. I want to thank all of you for joining and listening, and I have to say it was quite terrifying when I suddenly realized that I might have more than 50 different screens listening to me when I'm barely this much ahead of some of you in terms of what I know. But I hope it's been helpful bringing the name of Helen Susman back into the conversations that we're having, and that we can all take inspiration from the way in which she went about doing her work and making a difference in the way that I hope that we all feel that we can continue to do that, whether whatever our age, whatever our background, we too can make a difference. So thank you to all of you who've joined this evening, and do by all means contact me if you feel you can add anything to the store of knowledge that we have collectively about the wonderful Helen Suzman. And I thought I might get asked it, but as I haven't, we tend to know about Janet Suzman in this country, the actress. Indeed, she was Helen Suzman's niece.
Yeah.
So there is a family relationship there.
Yeah.
And with that, one more piece of information. If I thank you all very much, I'm going to suggest we end the recording right here, if that's all right, Tanya.